Welcome to Narrative Nights. Step into a world of mystery, intrigue, and suspense. At Narrative Nights, we bring you thrilling detective stories that will challenge your mind and keep you guessing until the very end. Before we begin, we'd love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop a comment and let us know which part of the globe you're watching from. We're all united by the love of a good mystery. Let the investigation begin.
Miss Marple and Whispers at Willowbank. Chapter 1. The Sound of Nothing. It was the sort of morning that made even the most practical of villagers stop and look up at the sky. Autumn had crept gently into St. Mary Mead, brushing the hedgerows with gold and laying a fine mist across the meadows. The air smelled faintly of smoke and ripe apples. Miss Marple, wrapped neatly in a pale blue cardigan, stood on her doorstep and examined the day with mild approval. "It's the sort of weather," she said aloud to no one in particular, "that makes one feel something is about to happen." As if summoned by her own words, the postman rounded the bend with his usual clatter of bicycle wheels. He handed her 2 letters, one a flyer for discounted gooseberry jam, and the other, more interestingly, a note from Mrs. Vicarage inviting her to tea that afternoon. Miss Marple smiled and stepped back inside, already suspecting the subject of their conversation. For several days now, the village had buzzed with news of Clara Fanshawe's return. Clara, the young widow of an army captain lost in India, had inherited Willowbank House, a rambling old manor perched near the bend of the river. The house had stood empty for nearly 4 years, shrouded in ivy and silence. It had once belonged to Clara's great-aunt, Miss Agatha Rowntree, a stern and reclusive woman who had spoken to few and trusted even fewer. By 3 o'clock, Miss Marple was comfortably settled in the vicar's drawing-room, sipping weak tea and listening to Mrs. Hartnell's rather breathless account of recent events. "She's barely been back a week, dear Jane," said the vicar's wife, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "and already half the servants want to leave." "Really?" said Miss Marple, stirring her tea with thoughtful precision. "How very sudden." "Oh yes. The housekeeper, Mrs. Biggs, swears she hears footsteps in the attic at night. And the young maid, Edie, says someone moved her hairbrush. Moved it, mind you. As if ghosts care for grooming tools." Miss Marple gave a small smile. People often confuse the ordinary with the extraordinary when they are frightened, particularly in old houses with long shadows. "True," sighed Mrs. Hartnell, "but I must say, there's something odd about that house. One feels it, don't you know? And then there's poor Mr. Lyle." "Ah," said Miss Marple, tilting her head slightly. "Yes, I had heard. A fall, wasn't it?" "A dreadful one," Mrs. Hartnell replied, placing her cup down with a soft clink. "They found him yesterday morning in the rose garden. Face down. The doctor said it was his neck, broken clean. Clara had invited a few people to a little gathering, just neighbors really. Nothing grand. And he slipped away for a smoke, they think. No one noticed he hadn't returned until dusk." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind already filing the details away. "He was a careful sort of man, Mr. Lyle. Not the kind to trip easily." "No," agreed Mrs. Hartnell, leaning forward. "And here's the strange thing, Clara swears she saw someone walking near the garden after the others had gone. A tall figure, moving quite fast. But it was dark, and her dog began barking like mad. She assumed it was a poacher or a rambler. But I wonder." "So do I," said Miss Marple, setting her cup aside. "And was anything else unusual?" Mrs. Hartnell hesitated. "Well, this is rather silly. But Clara mentioned that the clock in the drawing-room had stopped, again, at precisely 3:12. For the 3rd night in a row. No wind, no tremor. Just silence. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. How very precise. And there's one more thing, Mrs. Hartnell added, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara says there's a room in the West Wing she doesn't like to go near. She says it feels wrong. Cold, still. And the cat won't go near it. Animals always know, don't they? Miss Marple did not answer at once. She looked out the window toward the distant curve of the river, where Willowbank House crouched like a brooding cat behind the trees. The house had once hosted elegant teas and garden concerts. That was long ago, before Miss Rowntree withdrew from society and locked herself away in silence. Some houses, Miss Marple said softly, hold their breath for years. Then, when someone returns to open the doors, all the old air rushes out. A long pause followed. The fire crackled, and the mantel clock ticked politely. Finally, Miss Marple rose, tucking her gloves into her handbag. I think, she said, I might go and pay a call on Mrs. Fanshawe tomorrow. It's always a good idea to make a new neighbor feel welcome, especially when they live in an old house where silence has lingered far too long. As she walked home, the mist began to creep along the lane again, curling around the hedges and fences like fingers. And above it all, Willowbank House stood still, its windows dark, its walls heavy with secrets. Miss Marple didn't believe in ghosts. But she did believe in human nature and the quiet, dangerous things that people tried to hide. Chapter 2: A House of Whispers. Miss Marple believed in proper introductions. Though she had met Clara Fanshawe once or twice as a child, it had been years, and a lady should not arrive unannounced. So the next morning, after a neat breakfast of poached egg and toast, she telephoned Willowbank House. A young voice answered, breathless, uncertain. Willowbank House. Miss Fanshawe's residence. This is Miss Marple of St. Mary Mead. Might I call for a brief visit this afternoon? I would so like to welcome Mrs. Fanshawe back to the village. There was a pause. Oh, yes, of course. Clara will be delighted. The voice hung up quickly, and Miss Marple was left with a faint frown. Young people these days seemed always in a hurry, as though speaking too long on the telephone would drain their very breath. By 2 o'clock, Miss Marple had dressed with particular care, dove grey wool, sensible shoes, and a soft lilac brooch pin just so. She arrived at Willowbank by foot, the path winding through tall hedges and trees heavy with turning leaves. The house loomed at the end, dark against the sky, with its many-paned windows and sagging gables. Time had not been kind to it. The door was opened by a girl of about 19 with wide eyes and a nervous air. You must be Edie, Miss Marple said kindly. You answered the telephone earlier. Yes, Miss, I mean, Miss Marple. Please do come in. Inside, the house smelled of lavender polish and old stone. The entrance hall was vast, the floor uneven, and portraits lined the walls, stern women and distant-eyed men, all with the look of having judged you already. Clara Fanshawe appeared a moment later. She was pale, dressed in soft blue, with auburn hair swept back carelessly. Her smile was genuine, though touched with weariness. Miss Marple, how lovely of you to come. I remember you from my aunt's garden parties, when I was 10 and wore a dreadful bonnet. Miss Marple chuckled. And I remember you as the child who insisted on catching frogs in your petticoat. Clara's laugh came quickly, but faded just as fast. Do come through. The drawing-room is warmer. The room she led her into had high ceilings, faded green wallpaper, and a large bay window overlooking the overgrown garden. The clock on the mantel had indeed stopped, its hands fixed stubbornly at 3:12. Miss Marple took a quiet mental note. They sat on either side of the fire, teacups in hand. Edie brought in a silver tray of biscuits and vanished as though chased. I imagine this place feels very different after your years abroad, Miss Marple offered gently. Clara stirred her tea without drinking it. It does. I thought it would feel like coming home. But it hasn't. Not really. She hesitated. The truth is, I've hardly slept since I arrived. It's silly, I know, but the house creaks in strange ways. And sometimes I feel as if someone else is here. Miss Marple tilted her head. Someone alive? Clara met her gaze. Yes. And no. Sometimes I think I hear breathing. But when I listen, there's nothing. Miss Marple was silent for a moment. You know, Clara, fear is a clever creature. It dresses itself in logic, but it feeds on memory. Clara blinked. I've never heard it put quite like that. Tell me, Miss Marple said, setting her cup down, Mr. Lyle. How well did you know him? Hardly at all. He came recommended by the Historical Society. Said he wanted to write a piece on the house, its structure, its records. He was polite, respectful, and curious. Perhaps too curious. In what way? Clara looked away. He kept asking about a room in the West Wing, the nursery. He said it wasn't on the plans from the 1870s, but that he'd read something about it in a local journal. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. And was he correct? Clara nodded. Clara nodded. The nursery was built after a fire in 1881. My great-grandfather had it added during renovations. But it's always been closed off. My great-aunt Agatha never allowed anyone in there after the accident. Miss Marple didn't press. She had learned that people offered their stories like drawers, they opened when ready. As they spoke, the wind shifted outside, brushing dry leaves across the windows. Somewhere above, a door creaked and then slammed shut with a sudden, echoing bang. Clara flinched. That happens every afternoon. Always at the same time. I've checked the latch, the window, it's all intact. Miss Marple looked calmly toward the ceiling. May I ask, did Mr. Lyle go upstairs the day of the gathering? Clara considered. Yes, I believe he did. He asked to see the library, which is just above the drawing room. I told him to help himself. And the rose garden? Where he was found? Clara's brow creased. It's just beyond the terrace. I assumed he stepped out for air, but now I wonder if he was pushed. Miss Marple rose slowly and walked to the window. From there, she could see the terrace, the sloping garden, and the hedge separating the property from the river bank. The roses had faded for the season, but the soil bore fresh cuts someone had dug recently. She turned back to Clara. Has anyone been in the garden since his death? Only the gardener, I imagine. Mr. Chubb, he's worked here for decades. Knows the land better than anyone. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Gardens are honest places. They show signs when something's disturbed. She collected her gloves. Thank you, Clara. I shan't stay longer. But I wonder if I might return in a day or two. I've always been fond of Willowbank's wisteria. Clara managed a smile. You're welcome any time. Truly. As Miss Marple stepped outside, the air felt heavier, the silence deeper. A crow called from the woods, sharp and sudden. She paused, listening, not just to the sound, but to the quiet that followed. There was, indeed, a sort of silence at Willowbank House. And it wasn't the peaceful kind. Chapter 3: Echoes from the Past. Miss Marple had always believed that history, like dust, settled quietly in corners until something came along to stir it up. And Willowbank House, she thought, had recently been given quite a shake. 2 days after her visit to Clara, Miss Marple walked to the village library, her pace brisk, her umbrella tucked neatly under her arm. The day was dull and grey, and the clouds hung low, heavy with unshed rain. A perfect morning for research. Inside, the library smelled of old leather and ink. The shelves loomed high. The librarian, Miss Marple, blinked slowly behind round spectacles as Miss Marple approached. "Good morning, dear," Miss Marple said sweetly. "I'm looking for any local histories about Willowbank House. Something that might mention its early days, or the Roundtree family." Miss Marple pursed her lips. "It's not a cheerful subject, I must say. That family had their share of tragedy." "Quite," said Miss Marple. "But tragedy, as I've found, often has interesting footnotes." 10 minutes later, Miss Marple sat in a quiet reading nook with 3 slim volumes, a notebook, and her glasses perched at a thoughtful angle. The oldest book, Fallen Houses of Sussex, was particularly promising. In Chapter 4, she found a paragraph that made her pause. The fire of 1881 at Willowbank, believed to have started in the West Wing, claimed the life of a housemaid, Lydia Braithwaite. Though ruled accidental, whispers of improper conduct and a hasty cover-up followed. The nursery was rebuilt soon after, but the wing remained largely unused for decades. Miss Marple tapped her pencil against the table. She recalled Clara's comment about the closed nursery. Perhaps Mr. Lyle had stumbled across something connected to that long-forgotten incident. Another entry, in a journal dated 1932, recorded an interview with Miss Agatha Roundtree, Clara's great-aunt. "I do not permit strangers to enter the West Wing. That part of the house is not suitable for guests. Some places should remain closed." Miss Marple closed the book slowly. The past, she knew, rarely stayed locked away, especially when people insisted it must. Later that afternoon, she visited the vicarage and found the Reverend Clement in the garden, struggling with a stubborn patch of brambles. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, straightening. "Come to rescue me?" "Not today, I'm afraid," she smiled. "I wondered if you remember anything of the fire at Willowbank. You were a boy then, I suppose." The vicar wiped his brow with a handkerchief. "I do recall something. My mother used to say Willowbank was a house with a shadow. There was talk of a servant girl dying in a fire. Poor thing. And my father always said Miss Agatha never recovered. Became reclusive, refused visitors, that sort of thing. Did the girl have family in the village? Lydia Braithwaite? Possibly. There was an older brother, I think. Name of Elias. Quiet sort. Left for London not long after." "Thank you," said Miss Marple, her eyes thoughtful. "These old stories do have a way of bubbling up again, don't they?" The vicar gave her a curious look. "You don't believe that poor historian simply slipped, do you?" "I rarely believe in simple slips," she said gently. That evening, Miss Marple reviewed her notes. So far, she had a historian dead in the garden after poking about the house's hidden past. A West Wing nursery long closed, linked to a forgotten fire. A housemaid who died mysteriously, followed by a brother who vanished from the village. Add to that Clara's fear, the stopped clock, and the nervous maid who acted as though the walls themselves were listening. It was all very quiet. And Miss Marple did not trust quiet things. The next morning brought fog and a knock at her door. The next morning brought fog and a knock at her door. Edie stood outside, pale and visibly shaken. "I'm sorry, miss," she said, "but I didn't know who else to come to. It's Miss Clara. She's not right. I mean, she's there and everything, but she's so quiet. She just sits in the nursery now." Miss Marple blinked. "The nursery?" "She said it was locked." "It was. But she had the key. Found it behind a picture frame in the study. I shouldn't say this, but something's wrong in there. The room's so cold. And the mirror, it cracked last night. All on its own." Miss Marple patted Edie's hand. "You were quite right to come." By noon she was once again standing in the vast, echoing hall of Willowbank House. Clara appeared, pale as parchment and oddly still. "Would you like to see it?" she asked without preamble. Miss Marple nodded. They climbed the stairs, their footsteps muffled by the worn runner. The West Wing hallway was dim and airless, as if time itself had given up and gone elsewhere. Clara unlocked a heavy door at the end and stepped inside. The nursery was small, lined with faded wallpaper of lambs and daffodils. A wooden rocking horse sat in the corner, its mane moth-eaten. A mobile hung from the ceiling, motionless despite the draft. And in the center of the room, on a tiny table, sat a music box. Clara picked it up. "It started playing on its own last night," she whispered. "Just a few notes." Miss Marple took it gently. "It's wound," she noted. "Someone must have been here." Clara looked at her, eyes wide. But the door was locked. Miss Marple turned toward the window. A set of dusty footprints led across the faded carpet, small, precise. "May I ask, Clara," she said slowly, "has anyone else been inside this wing since you arrived?" Clara's voice trembled. "Only Judith. But she's gone now. She left yesterday to visit a cousin in Dorset." Miss Marple nodded, though her mind stirred. The timing was convenient. And the silence that lingered in this room felt far more human than ghostly. As she left the house, Miss Marple glanced once more toward the river. Mist swirled above the water. Somewhere out there, something, or someone, was watching. And the past, long buried beneath ash and ivy, was beginning to speak again. Chapter 4: The Night Visitor. The next few days brought a steady drizzle that softened the edges of everything. St. Mary Mead glistened with wet leaves and puddles, and the air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. Even the birds seemed quieter, as if waiting for something to pass. Miss Marple, however, was not idle. Between polite chats at the greengrocer and quiet afternoons of knitting, she pieced together her impressions. There was no doubt in her mind now. What had begun as whispers and old stories had shifted into something much more immediate. Something dangerous. It was on the third evening after her visit to the nursery that she received a rather unexpected guest. Clara Fanshawe arrived just past 6, drenched to the bone and pale with fear. Her coat was buttoned unevenly, and her eyes darted to every corner of the sitting room before she spoke. I don't know why I came. I just needed to be somewhere that isn't there." Miss Marple set aside her knitting and guided her gently to the fire. "Tell me what happened." Clara looked down at her trembling hands. "Last night, I was woken by the sound of the piano. Only 2 notes, over and over. D, F, D, F. It came from downstairs." Miss Marple said nothing, but her knitting needles stilled. I lit a candle and went down. The keys were still air-moving. Slowly. But the lid was down, Miss Marple. Shut. Locked. Miss Marple frowned. Did anyone else hear it? No. Edie was away visiting her sister in Eastbourne. And the gardener lives in the cottage at the edge of the property. I was alone. Clara took a shaky breath. Then this morning, I found a footprint. Just one. In the hall. A man's boot, damp with mud. But the door was locked from the inside. Miss Marple rose and crossed to the sideboard. She poured Clara a small glass of sherry and pressed it gently into her hands. "My dear," she said kindly, "you are not going mad. But someone would like you to think you are." Clara looked up, her lips parted slightly. "Do you really believe that?" "Yes. In fact, I believe someone is playing a careful game, one built not on ghosts, but on memory and fear." Miss Marple sat again, her tone thoughtful. There is a particular kind of cruelty in unsettling a person's sense of reality. It's clever, in its way. No marks. No screams. Just silence. And doubt. Clara shivered. "But why?" "That," said Miss Marple, "we shall uncover. Tell me, how long has Miss Hanley been gone now?" "Judith?" 3 days. She sent a postcard. She's staying with her cousin near Lyme Regis. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And yet, from what I recall, she never liked to leave you alone. Especially not at Willowbank." Clara hesitated. "No, she didn't. In fact, she argued with me about it. Said it wasn't a good time to travel. But then she changed her mind quite suddenly." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "How odd. Might I borrow that postcard, if you still have it?" Clara fished it from her coat pocket and handed it over. The handwriting was neat, the message brief. "Hope you are resting. Will write again soon. Judith." But it wasn't the message that caught Miss Marple's attention, it was the postmark. "Dear me," she murmured. "Posted in St. Mary Mead. Not Dorset." Clara's eyes widened. "What does that mean?" "It means, my dear, that Judith never left the village at all." That night, Miss Marple did something she rarely did. She left her cottage after dark. With her sensible shoes and a sturdy umbrella, she made her way along the back lane toward Willowbank House. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the only sound was the faint rustle of trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. She approached the gate quietly, noting the gardener's cottage was dark. No sign of movement. Miss Marple waited by the hedge, watching. At first, there was nothing. Then, from the far side of the house, she saw it, a flicker of torchlight through the west wing windows. The nursery. Someone was inside. She stepped forward just enough to see the figure move through the hallway. A woman, tall, brisk, familiar. Judith Hanley. She disappeared into the room, and moments later, the light went out. Miss Marple waited a full 5 minutes before retracing her steps. She knew better than to approach while the figure was still inside. The next morning, after breakfast, she made her way to Willowbank once more. This time, she brought something with her, a photograph she had found in a library pamphlet about the village's 1920s charity fair. It showed a group of ladies in wide hats and long skirts, gathered by a tea tent. One of them, standing slightly apart, looked strikingly familiar. When Clara answered the door, Miss Marple held up the photo. "Do you recognize her?" Clara looked closely. "That's Agatha Rowntree." "But who's the one beside her?" According to the caption, Miss Marple said calmly, "that is Beatrice Hanley, Judith's mother." Clara blinked. "I didn't know they were connected." "Most people wouldn't. But I believe there's a great deal more linking your companion to Willowbank than she has admitted." They sat in the drawing room once more. The clock, as ever, read 3:12. "She said she came to help after my husband died," Clara murmured. "Said she wanted a change. That we were distant cousins, though I never remembered meeting her before." Miss Marple nodded. "What if Judith came not to help you, but to reclaim something? Something she believes was wrongfully taken." Clara went very still. "You think she's behind all this?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that someone wanted to frighten you away from Willowbank. And when that failed, they turned to more desperate measures." "But Mr. Lyle, what did he have to do with it?" Miss Marple didn't answer directly. She rose and went to the window, gazing out at the misty garden. "I believe he knew something. Or found something. Perhaps about Lydia Braithwaite, or about the will your great-aunt left behind. Something worth silencing." Clara looked shaken. "What do I do?" "For now," said Miss Marple, "nothing. But I shall have a word with the inspector. Quietly. There's nothing ghosts hate more than being caught in daylight." And as she left the house, Miss Marple looked once more toward the west wing, where shadows lingered and secrets waited. The silence at Willowbank House had begun to crack. And something, or someone, was about to be heard. Chapter 5: The Man with a Scar. The rain had passed by morning, leaving behind a glistening hush across St. Mary Mead. The hedgerows dripped softly, and the sun, though pale, cast a gentle glow on the tiled rooftops and crooked lanes. Miss Marple, seated by her window with a shawl tucked round her shoulders, watched a blackbird peck thoughtfully at the garden path. She had been thinking, carefully, deliberately. Judith Hanley's quiet deceit, the old fire in the west wing, the broken clock, the music in the night, and now the muddy boot print. Each piece hinted at something far older than simple malice. It was, she suspected, about memory and inheritance. But there was one figure she had not yet spoken to. One who had worked at Willowbank far longer than anyone else. One who kept to himself, but who surely knew the ground better than anyone alive. Mr. Chubb, the gardener. By midday, Miss Marple set out with a basket of shortbread and a soft determination in her step. She followed the lane past the vicarage, beyond the old mill pond, until the small brick cottage came into view. It sat just at the edge of Willowbank's grounds, tucked behind a twisted hedge of hawthorn. She knocked gently, and after a pause, the door opened. Mr. Chubb was a man of about 60, weathered by sun and soil. He had the solid build of a man who worked with his hands and a stiff, slightly stooped posture. But it was the scar that drew the eye, a pale, jagged line running from the corner of his left brow to the side of his jaw. "Miss Marple," he said with a grunt. "Didn't expect company." "I've brought shortbread," she replied pleasantly. "And perhaps a few questions." He gave her a long, assessing look, then stepped aside. "I've got the kettle on." The cottage was small, tidy, and smelled faintly of tobacco and linseed oil. A row of gardening medals lined the mantel, and a faded photograph of a woman in nurse's uniform stood beside them. "Your late wife?" Miss Marple asked gently, indicating the photo. "Mary. Died 5 years back. Kept this place running, she did." He poured tea with a surprisingly delicate hand and passed her a mug. Miss Marple placed the shortbread on the table and Saturday. "I wonder," she began mildly, "if you might tell me about the day Mr. Lyle died." Mr. Chubb's expression tightened. Tragic business, that. Never saw it coming. Were you working that afternoon? Course I was. Down by the river, hedge trimming. He scratched his chin. Saw the historian bloke step out for a smoke. Had a notebook with him. Didn't come back. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Did you speak with him? Only once or twice. Asked about the old building work. Said he'd found a reference to a sealed room. And did he? Mr. Chubb's eyes flicked toward the fire. Wouldn't know. That house has secrets. Always did. She watched him quietly. You've worked there a long time. 38 years. Started under Miss Agatha herself. Kept the roses, the pond, the maze. Knew every brick before it started falling apart. Then you must remember the fire. His jaw tensed. Don't see how that's relevant. I think it may be more relevant than anyone realizes. Mr. Chubb stood and crossed to the window. His voice, when it came, was low. They said it was the girl's fault. Lydia. Left a candle burning. You didn't believe it. He turned, his scar catching the light. She was a good girl. Careful. Sweet on someone, I think. Used to hum in the garden when she thought no one was listening. Miss Marple folded her hands. Was she in love? He nodded. That's what I think. But not with someone she should have been. Someone from the house. He didn't answer directly. After she died, Miss Agatha went mad with grief. Shut up the room, banned the servants from speaking her name. I found the child's toy in the ashes myself. A little stuffed dog. Burnt to a crisp. Miss Marple felt a chill brush her neck. Did Mr. Lyle ask about Lydia? Mr. Chubb nodded. He said he was trying to trace her family. Said there was talk of a baby, illegitimate. Might have been hushed up. He said he'd found a baptism record with no surname listed. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. And then he died. Mr. Chubb turned back to her. You think that was murder? I think he was getting too close. They sat in silence for a moment. Finally, Miss Marple rose. Thank you, Mr. Chubb. This has been most helpful. He gave her a brief nod. Watch yourself, Miss Marple. That house still burns, even if the flames are out. As she walked back through the gate, her mind worked steadily. A child. A cover-up. A sealed room. Judith Hanley, claiming kinship but concealing her mother's connection. And now Clara, terrified and alone, unaware she might be living in the middle of a slow, quiet revenge. That afternoon, Miss Marple went to the post office and asked to see old church records. With her usual soft-spoken charm, she convinced Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, to allow her a peek at the baptism ledgers kept in the safe. And there it was. 1902. Unnamed female infant. Mother, L. the Braithwaite. Father, not listed. Witness, B. Hanley. Miss Marple's pencil tapped the desk. So Beatrice Hanley, Judith's mother, had been the godparent, or more. Perhaps more. She left the post office with a storm in her mind. If Lydia Braithwaite had had a child, and that child had survived, then everything, the house, the will, even Clara's inheritance, could be called into question. Someone knew. Someone was trying to erase the past before it was discovered. And Miss Marple, despite her age and soft voice, had no intention of letting them succeed. Chapter 6. A Voice in the Fog. The fog rolled into St. Mary Mead without warning. By evening, the village was swallowed in a pale, creeping mist that curled along the ground like smoke from an unseen fire. Lanterns glowed dimly through it, and even the familiar shapes of cottages and fences seemed strange and distant. A hush fell over everything, muffling sound and making footsteps on the cobbled lanes seem louder than usual. Miss Marple was not one to be frightened by fog. In fact, she rather liked the way it sharpened one's other senses. Listening became more important than looking, and details often overlooked took on new meaning. But that night, she could not shake the sense that something was drawing closer. Something long buried. After her visit to Mr. Chubb and the church records, she had no doubt now there had been a child. A baby girl. Lydia Braithwaite's. And Beatrice Hanley, Judith's mother, had something to do with it. Possibly everything. And if Miss Marple's hunch was right, Judith Hanley might not just be Clara's kindly housemate. She might have a rightful claim to Willowbank House. A motive, Miss Marple thought grimly. A very strong one indeed. That evening, she invited Inspector Craddock for tea. He was the only one in the county she trusted to believe her without raising a fuss. He arrived precisely at 7, wiping his boots and rubbing his hands by the fire. "I must say," he remarked, settling into the armchair, "you do choose the most inconvenient weather for your investigations, Aunt Jane." Miss Marple smiled. "You know I never choose the moment, Dermot. It chooses me. I hear from young Constable Jameson that you've been seen snooping about Willowbank again. Something troubling you?" She poured him a cup of tea and added just the right amount of milk. "Do you remember the Lydia Braithwaite case?" He frowned. "The nursery fire?" "Yes, vaguely. Declared accidental, if I recall. No sign of foul play. There was a child," Miss Marple said calmly. "Born secretly. Lydia was only 17. Craddock sat straighter. "You're certain?" "I've seen the baptism record myself." "No surname." "Witnessed by Beatrice Hanley, Judith's mother." Craddock's brows furrowed. "So you think Judith is Lydia's daughter?" Miss Marple nodded. "And the only possible heir to Willowbank if Miss Agatha's original will was changed." And Mr. Lyle was getting too close to the truth. "Precisely." Craddock rubbed his jaw. "But motive alone isn't enough. We need proof." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully toward the fire. "Then we must stir the ashes again, mustn't we?" Later that night, the fog thickened. Willowbank House loomed like a ghost ship behind the veil. Clara sat by the drawing-room fire, alone again, her hands clenched tightly around a book she wasn't reading. The silence had returned, too complete, too careful. Then came the sound. A creak. A low, deliberate groan of floorboards. Followed by a faint tap, 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 like someone walking slowly across the upper landing. Clara froze. She waited, listening. It came again. 3 steps. Then silence. Then a 4th. She stood, heart pounding, and moved to the base of the stairs. "Judith," she called, her voice thin. "Is that you?" No answer. Only the wind brushing past the windows like a breath held too long. She took 1 step up, then another. The hall above stretched into shadows. And then, suddenly, she heard it, soft, almost whispered. "Clara." She turned sharply, but no one was there. "Clara." It came from behind the nursery door. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle. The door swung open on its own. The nursery was empty. But the rocking horse moved. Not wildly, not by wind, but with a steady, gentle rhythm. Rock, rock, rock. And in the mirror by the fireplace, a faint foggy shape, like a handprint, smudged the glass. Clara screamed. When the police arrived, Judith was already there, holding Clara tightly and trying to calm her. The older woman's face was pale, her lips tight. "I was in the garden shed," she said, when Inspector Craddock questioned her. Clara thought she heard something. "I ran back when I heard her scream." Miss Marple arrived shortly after, her face calm, eyes sharp. "Was anything taken?" she asked quietly. "No," Craddock replied. But the door to the west wing was found unlocked. "Again?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I think it's time," she said, "that we looked into that wing properly." The next morning, with Inspector Craddock, Miss Marple, and Clara all present, they entered the west wing. It was musty, unused, and strangely cold. Dust lay thick across the floors, and white sheets covered the old furniture like ghostly drapes. But it was the far wall that drew Miss Marple's attention. Behind a tall bookcase, they found it, a sealed doorway, bricked up but hastily. Someone had tried to hide it not long ago. "Fetch Mr. Chubb," Craddock ordered. "We'll get this open." It took less than an hour to break through. The hidden room was small. It smelled of smoke and age. The wallpaper was scorched in one corner, and the charred remains of a doll's cot lay half covered in dust. In the far corner, something glinted. Miss Marple moved forward, brushing away ash. A metal tin. Inside, papers. Letters. The top one bore the initials LB and began. "Dearest B, I am frightened. They will never let us keep her. They say it would ruin everything. But I cannot send her away. I love her." Miss Marple handed it silently to Craddock. "Lydia to Beatrice," she said softly. "About the child. And now," she added, almost to herself, "we know why Mr. Lyle had to die." She turned back to Clara, who stood frozen in the doorway. "Clara," she said gently, "I believe it's time you knew who Judith really is." Chapter 7: The Truth in the Ashes. A heavy silence had settled over Willowbank House since the discovery of the hidden room. Clara sat in the drawing-room staring at the letter Miss Marple had found, her hands trembling slightly as she reread the faded words. Outside, the fog had finally lifted, but inside, shadows still clung to the corners of the house. Judith Hanley had retreated to her room, refusing visitors. The doors were shut, the curtains drawn, and no sound came from behind them. Inspector Craddock had asked to speak with her twice, but each time, she'd sent a message through the maid, later. "I need time." Miss Marple, however, was not one to be put off. She rose early that morning, dressed in her neat grey cardigan and sensible shoes, and made her way quietly to the first-floor landing. The house, though grand, was old, and the floorboards gave only the softest creak beneath her steps. She paused outside Judith's room and knocked. "Judith, dear," she said gently. "It's Miss Marple. I think we should talk." There was a long pause. Then a sigh. The door opened just a crack. Judith looked tired, more so than usual. Her hair was untidy, her eyes rimmed with dark circles. But there was something else, too, something harder to name. Defeat, perhaps. Or acceptance. "Come in," she said quietly. The room was simple, with a writing desk in the corner and a faded photograph of a woman on the nightstand. Miss Marple noticed it immediately. "Your mother?" she asked. Judith nodded. Beatrice Hanley. She was a nurse. Worked for the Braithwaites before the war. Miss Marple settled into the armchair by the fire. She helped Lydia hide the child, didn't she? Judith sat opposite, her fingers twisting in her lap. Yes. Lydia was just a girl. 17, and in love with someone she could never marry. A man from the village. They hid it from Miss Agatha. She would never have allowed such disgrace. And the baby? She was born right here, in this house. In secret. My mother helped deliver her. Judith paused. But Miss Agatha found out. And everything fell apart. Did the fire happen that night? Judith looked away. That's what they always said. That Lydia left a candle burning. But I think it was set deliberately. To cover up what had happened. Lydia died, and the child, well, they said she was lost in the flames too. But she wasn't. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. She survived. Judith nodded. My mother took her away before the fire started. Hid her with a family in Devon. She never told anyone, not even me, until she was dying. Then she gave me the letters. And told me who I really was. You're Lydia's daughter, Miss Marple said softly. Judith's eyes filled with tears. Yes. I'm the child Miss Agatha tried to erase. Miss Marple said nothing for a long time. The fire crackled gently. At last, she spoke. Why didn't you tell Clara? Judith's voice cracked. Because I didn't know what I'd do. Part of me thought I'd let it go. Let her have the house. She's good and kind. But then that man came, Mr. Lyle. Digging into the past. And you feared the truth would come out. Judith hesitated. He asked too many questions. About the West Wing. About Lydia. He said he'd found records. A will that had never been read. Did you kill him, Judith? Judith shook her head, fiercely. No. I swear. I was frightened, yes. But I never touched him. Miss Marple studied her closely. There was truth in her voice. Pain, certainly, but not guilt. She rose gently. Thank you for telling me. Downstairs, Inspector Craddock was examining the letters from the tin. She's telling the truth, he said quietly. These match the handwriting from Lydia's journals. And there's a signed statement, Miss Agatha's, saying the house was meant for Lydia and her descendants. Not for Clara. Miss Marple sat down beside him. So Clara has no legal claim. Not unless a new will was drawn later. But if not, she's been living in a house that never belonged to her. Craddock exhaled slowly. And someone knew. Someone wanted to keep it quiet. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the fire. We've been looking at Judith and Clara. But perhaps we've missed someone else. Craddock looked puzzled. Who? Miss Marple reached into her handbag and produced a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. A button, she said. Found it in the sealed nursery room. Not scorched, not old. Recent. Craddock leaned closer. Looks like it came from a uniform. Gardening overalls, Miss Marple said. And there's only one man who still wears those. Craddock sat up. Mr. Chubb? Miss Marple nodded. He was devoted to Miss Agatha. Stayed after the fire. Looked after the house. And more importantly, he knew the secret. He must have helped seal the nursery. He even warned me that house still burns, even if the flames are out. Craddock stood. You think he killed Lyle? Miss Marple's expression was grave. I think he's been keeping a terrible promise. One he made years ago. And when Lyle threatened to reveal the truth, he acted out of loyalty. But why frighten Clara? Craddock asked. The music, the footsteps, the nursery mirror. Miss Marple's voice was soft. Because she reminded him of Lydia. Because guilt has a way of echoing. Perhaps he meant to protect her, in a twisted way. Or perhaps the line between love and fear has blurred for him. A knock sounded at the door. Constable Jameson entered, breathless. Sir, a Mr. Chubb's cottage. He's gone. Left a note. Craddock took it, read quickly, then passed it to Miss Marple. It was short, written in firm, old-fashioned script. I kept her secret. I did what was asked. I never meant harm. But the dead don't stay quiet. Forgive me. Miss Marple folded the paper slowly. It's not over, she said softly. Not yet. There's one more truth still waiting in the ashes. Chapter 8. The Silence Broken. The next morning dawned cold and clear. The fog had lifted entirely, leaving the trees around Willowbank House stark against a pale blue sky. It was as if the village itself had exhaled, shedding the weight of the past. But within the drawing room of Willowbank, a different kind of storm was gathering. Miss Marple sat upright in her chair, her knitting folded beside her, untouched. Across from her sat Clara Elwell, pale and quiet. Inspector Craddock stood near the fireplace, arms folded. Judith Hanley hovered by the window, wringing her hands. The silence was broken by the door opening. Mr. Chubb entered, flanked by 2 constables. He looked older than before. His cap was gone, and his shoulders stooped. There was no fight in him, only the weariness of a man who had carried too much for too long. I came back, he said gruffly. Didn't get far. Only the allotments. Thank you, said Miss Marple, gently. He looked at her, eyes heavy. I knew you'd figure it out, Miss Marple. You always do. Craddock gestured for him to sit, but Mr. Chubb remained standing. You should hear it from me. All of it. Miss Marple nodded. Please. He cleared his throat. I was just a young man when Lydia died. I'd worked here since I was a lad, sweeping the stables, minding the gardens. Miss Agatha, she trusted me. He looked over at Judith. She was a good girl, your mother. Beatrice. Kind. And she loved Lydia like a sister. So when she found out Lydia was expecting, she came to me. She didn't want the child to be taken, Judith whispered. No. Lydia was terrified. But Miss Agatha, she wouldn't hear of it. She said Lydia had brought shame to the family. Said she'd send the baby to some orphanage in the north. So, we made a plan. He paused, his hands clenching. Beatrice helped Lydia give birth here, in the West Wing. We moved furniture, made it look unused. I kept the housemaid busy. And the baby, Judith, was born healthy. He looked at her again. You were a strong one, even then. Judith bit her lip, holding back tears. Mr. Chubb continued. But we were discovered. Miss Agatha found out. She was furious. Said she'd end this once and for all. The night of the fire, Beatrice took the baby and fled, just as planned. But Lydia, she stayed. His voice faltered. I think she meant to confront Miss Agatha. Maybe beg her to change her mind. But the fire broke out before she could. Craddock stepped forward. You're saying the fire wasn't an accident? Mr. Chubb shook his head. Miss Agatha started it. Whether she meant to kill Lydia, I'll never know. But it was no candle left burning. I saw her standing outside, watching. And afterwards, she told me to say nothing. And you obeyed her. She paid Beatrice to disappear. Bricked up the nursery. Told everyone Lydia had died in a tragic accident and that the baby never existed. He sighed. I was weak. I told myself I was protecting the house. The family. But really, I was protecting myself. Miss Marple's voice was calm. And when Mr. Lyle arrived, Mr. Chubb's expression darkened. He came with files, questions. Said he was tracing wills. Wanted to know who Lydia's child was. Said the West Wing didn't match the plans he'd been given. I panicked. I thought, if he dug up the past, everything would come crashing down. Craddock's eyes narrowed. So you silenced him? Mr. Chubb looked away. I didn't mean to kill him. I followed him one evening when he went walking. We argued. He said he'd found proof. I pushed him. Just once. He slipped. Hit his head on a rock. There was so much blood. He swallowed. I thought about calling someone. But the damage was done. So I made it look like an accident. Hit his notebook. Cleaned the wound. Craddock took a deep breath. That's manslaughter, Mr. Chubb. You understand that? I do, sir, he said quietly. And I'll go quietly. But I wanted Judith to know her mother loved her. So did Lydia. There was a long pause. Then Clara stood, her face unreadable. Why didn't you tell me? She asked Judith. Judith hesitated. I didn't know how. You're the only family I've ever had. I didn't want to lose you. But the house, Clara looked around the drawing room, as if seeing it properly for the first time. It was never mine, was it? Miss Marple shook her head gently. Not legally. But I believe Miss Agatha meant to make you her heir later. Only she died before she could write a new will. I see. Clara turned to Judith and gave a sad smile. Well, it looks like it belongs to you now. The house, the truth, everything. Judith's eyes welled up. I don't want it if it means losing you. You won't, Clara whispered. We'll find a way. Miss Marple rose and picked up her knitting. The past has a way of speaking, you know. Through letters, through footsteps in the dark, and even through silence. It never truly goes away until it's acknowledged. Craddock turned to her. You've done it again, Aunt Jane. Solved it all. She smiled modestly. It wasn't difficult. Human nature rarely surprises me. Only how far people will go to bury it. Mr. Chubb was led away quietly. Outside, the sun warmed the gardens he had tended for half a century. And inside Willowbank House, for the first time in many years, the silence was broken.